The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her gear one final time. The 28-year-old combat medic from Texas had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, but nothing could have prepared her for what this particular patrol would bring. Her unit, Alpha Company, had received intelligence about a potential weapons cache hidden in a residential compound on the eastern edge of the city. Maria checked her medical supplies methodically, ensuring every bandage, every syringe, every life-saving tool was exactly where it needed to be. Her teammates often joked that she was obsessively organized, but in a war zone that obsession meant the difference between life and death. She had already saved 7 soldiers during her deployment, earning respect from even the most seasoned veterans in her unit. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles carrying 12 soldiers. Their mission seemed straightforward: investigate the compound, search for weapons, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Intelligence reports suggested the area was relatively quiet, with minimal insurgent activity in recent weeks. The local Iraqi police had even provided additional security assurances for the operation. As they drove through the narrow streets, Maria observed the daily life continuing around them. Children played soccer in vacant lots. Merchants sold fresh bread from small stands, and elderly men gathered in the shade discussing local affairs. The normalcy of it all created an almost peaceful atmosphere that made the soldiers relax slightly in their seats. Captain Rodriguez, the unit commander, briefed the team over the radio as they approached their destination. The compound was a 2-story concrete building surrounded by a low wall, typical of middle-class Iraqi homes. Aerial surveillance had shown no unusual activity, and thermal imaging detected only normal heat signatures inside the building. Maria felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came before every mission. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in Iraq, and something about this particular operation felt different. The intelligence seemed almost too clean, too perfect. In her experience, the most dangerous situations often came disguised as routine operations. The convoy slowed as they reached the target location. The first vehicle would provide overwatch while the second and third vehicles dropped off the search teams. Maria would accompany the main assault team, ready to provide medical support if needed. Her training at Fort Sam Houston had prepared her for combat medicine, but the reality of treating wounded soldiers under fire was something no training could fully simulate. As they dismounted from their vehicles, the sounds of the city seemed to fade away. The usual chatter of radio communications, the distant sounds of traffic, even the conversations of nearby civilians seemed muted. Maria positioned herself near the compound entrance, her medical bag slung across her shoulder and her rifle ready. The breach team moved forward with practiced precision. Years of training and months of combat experience had turned them into a cohesive unit that operated almost like a single organism. Maria watched as they approached the compound gate, every sense alert for signs of danger. The first explosion came without warning. A massive blast erupted from beneath the lead vehicle, lifting the armored truck off the ground and sending it crashing onto its side. The carefully planned operation instantly transformed into chaos, as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The peaceful neighborhood had become a deadly trap. Maria immediately moved toward the overturned vehicle, her medical training overriding every instinct for self-preservation. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see movement inside the wreckage. Someone was alive in there and they needed help immediately. The ambush had been perfectly planned, turning what should have been a routine search into a fight for survival. The sound of gunfire intensified as insurgents emerged from concealed positions throughout the neighborhood. Windows that had seemed empty suddenly blazed with muzzle flashes. Rooftops that appeared clear now hosted snipers with clear fields of fire. The entire operation had walked directly into a carefully orchestrated ambush. As Maria reached the overturned vehicle, she could hear the voice of Sergeant Williams calling for help from inside the twisted metal. The vehicle's armor had protected the occupants from the worst of the blast, but the soldiers inside were trapped and potentially seriously injured. She would have to get them out while under constant enemy fire. The radio crackled with urgent communications as the remaining vehicles tried to coordinate a response to the ambush. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos, calling for immediate medical support and requesting backup from base. But Maria knew that help was at least 30 minutes away, and in a firefight, 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. She began working to extract the wounded soldiers from the vehicle, using every technique she had learned in medical training. The sound of bullets striking the armored hull created a constant metallic drumbeat that underscored the desperate nature of their situation. Each second that passed brought new dangers as the insurgent fire grew more coordinated and accurate. The neighborhood that had seemed so peaceful minutes earlier had transformed into a war zone, where every shadow could hide an enemy fighter and every window could conceal a sniper's rifle. Maria realized that survival would depend not just on her medical skills, but on her ability to think clearly under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The first bullet struck Maria in the shoulder as she pulled Sergeant Williams from the wreckage. The impact spun her around, but her adrenaline was so high that she barely registered the pain. Williams was unconscious with a severe head injury, and she knew he would die without immediate medical attention. The insurgent fire was coming from at least 4 different directions, creating deadly crossfire zones throughout the street. Maria dragged Williams behind the overturned vehicle, using its bulk as cover while she began emergency treatment. Her hands worked automatically, applying pressure bandages and checking for other injuries even as bullets continued to strike the metal around them. The training that had been drilled into her countless times now operated on pure instinct, allowing her to function despite the chaos surrounding them. Captain Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers had taken cover behind a concrete wall approximately 50 meters away, but the distance might as well have been a mile. The open ground between their positions was completely exposed to enemy fire, making movement nearly impossible. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio, coordinating defensive positions while calling repeatedly for backup support. The second bullet caught Maria in the leg as she moved to check on the other soldiers trapped in the vehicle. This time the pain was immediate and sharp, causing her to stumble and fall against the twisted metal. Blood began soaking through her uniform, but she forced herself to continue working. Private Johnson was trapped under a piece of the vehicle's interior, and his leg was clearly broken in multiple places. Working with increasing difficulty due to her own injuries, Maria managed to free Johnson and drag him to relative safety behind the vehicle. The insurgent fire was becoming more accurate as the fighters adjusted their positions to get better angles on the trapped Americans. She could hear voices calling in Arabic from the surrounding buildings, coordinating their attack. The third and fourth bullets struck almost simultaneously, one hitting her in the back and another grazing her head. The impact knocked her forward onto her hands and knees, and for a moment her vision went completely black. When it cleared, she found herself staring at a growing pool of her own blood on the dusty ground. Her medical bag had been torn open by shrapnel, scattering supplies across the area. Despite her wounds, Maria continued treating the injured soldiers. Johnson was going into shock from blood loss, and William still hadn't regained consciousness. She used her own clothing to create additional bandages, working methodically through her mental checklist of trauma procedures. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but stopping wasn't an option. The fifth bullet shattered her left arm as she reached for more medical supplies. The bone snapped with an audible crack and her arm went completely numb. She could no longer use both hands effectively, forcing her to adapt her treatment methods while working one-handed. The insurgents seemed to realize she was trying to help the wounded and were deliberately targeting her position. Rodriguez and his team were pinned down and running low on ammunition. Their calls for backup were becoming increasingly desperate as the insurgent fire intensified. The enemy fighters had clearly planned this ambush carefully, positioning themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that made any movement extremely dangerous. The Americans were trapped in what military tacticians call a kill zone. The sixth and seventh bullets struck Maria within seconds of each other, one hitting her in the chest and another in her lower back. The chest wound knocked the wind out of her completely, and she collapsed next to the soldier she was trying to save. Blood was now flowing freely from multiple wounds, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. Fighting against unconsciousness, Maria forced herself to continue working. She used her remaining functional hand to apply pressure to Johnson's wounds while trying to monitor Williams's vital signs. Her own breathing was becoming labored, and she could taste blood in her mouth. The metallic tang was a clear indication that at least one of her wounds was serious enough to cause internal bleeding. The eighth bullet struck her in the hip, spinning her completely around and causing her to fall heavily against the vehicle. The impact sent sharp pain shooting through her entire body, and she realized that her left leg was no longer responding to commands. Paralysis was setting in, either from nerve damage or blood loss, but she couldn't afford to stop working. Using the vehicle for support, Maria pulled herself back to where the wounded soldiers lay. Johnson's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid, classic signs of advancing shock. Williams was showing signs of increased intracranial pressure from his head injury. Both men would die without continued medical intervention, and she was their only hope for survival. The 9th and 10th bullets hit her almost simultaneously as she worked to stabilize Johnson's condition. One struck her in the shoulder again while the other hit her in the side. Each impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, and her vision was beginning to fade in and out. Blood loss was making it difficult to think clearly, but muscle memory kept her hands moving through the familiar motions of battlefield medicine. The insurgent fire was now so intense that the surviving members of her unit couldn't even raise their heads to return fire effectively. Rodriguez's radio calls were becoming increasingly frantic as he realized the extent of their situation. Backup was still at least 20 minutes away, and it was becoming clear that not everyone would survive that long. The 11th bullet struck Maria in the back of the head, sending her sprawling face first onto the ground. For several seconds, everything went completely dark and silent. When consciousness returned, she found herself lying in an expanding pool of blood, unable to move anything below her neck. The sounds of the firefight seemed distant and muffled, as if she were hearing them from underwater. Despite her catastrophic injuries, Maria's mind remained focused on her mission. Johnson and Williams were still alive, still breathing, still fighting for survival just meters away from her position. She had taken an oath to preserve life, and that oath didn't become void just because she was dying. Using the last of her strength, she began crawling toward the wounded soldiers, determined to continue treating them even if it killed her. The world had become a haze of pain and determination as Maria Santos lay bleeding in the Fallujah dust. Her body had been shattered by 11 bullets, but her mind remained locked on a single purpose: keeping Johnson and Williams alive. Every breath was agony. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her nervous system, yet she continued her slow crawl toward the wounded soldiers. Blood painted a crimson trail in the dirt behind her as she used her one functioning arm to pull her broken body forward. The insurgent gunfire continued to pound their position, but the sounds seemed distant now, muffled by the fog of massive blood loss and shock. Her vision kept fading to black before snapping back to painful clarity. Each returned to consciousness, bringing fresh awareness of her desperate situation. Johnson was going into deep shock, his skin pale and clammy despite the Iraqi heat. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and Maria could see that his pulse was weakening. Without immediate intervention, he would be dead within the hour. Williams remained unconscious from his head trauma, but his vital signs were more stable. If she had to choose which soldier to focus her remaining energy on, it would have to be Johnson. Using techniques she had never imagined she would need to employ while paralyzed, Maria managed to position herself next to Johnson's body. Her medical supplies were scattered across the area from the explosions and gunfire, but she could see a pressure bandage just within reach. Every movement to grab the bandage sent waves of agony through her shattered spine, but she forced herself to continue. The pressure bandage felt impossibly heavy in her weakened grip as she attempted to apply it to Johnson's most serious wound. Her hands were slippery with her own blood, making it difficult to maintain the fine motor control needed for medical procedures. She had to stop frequently to rest, her breathing becoming more labored as her body struggled to function with massive trauma. Captain Rodriguez's voice continued to crackle over the radio, but the transmission was becoming harder to hear. Either the radio was damaged or her hearing was beginning to fail. She could make out fragments of conversation about backup units and medical evacuation, but the timeline seemed impossibly distant. Help was coming, but it might arrive too late to matter. The insurgent attack showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the enemy fire was becoming more organized and systematic. Maria could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons being employed in coordination, suggesting that this wasn't a spontaneous ambush but a carefully planned operation. The enemy fighters knew exactly what they were doing, and they intended to kill every American in the convoy. As she worked on Johnson's wounds, Maria began talking to both unconscious soldiers. Her voice was weak and hoarse, barely above a whisper. But she had read that unconscious patients could sometimes hear voices around them. She told them about her hometown in Texas, about the BBQ restaurant her family owned, about anything that might keep them connected to life and fighting to survive. Her own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The 11 bullet wounds had caused massive internal and external bleeding, and she could feel her body beginning to shut down. Her hands were becoming numb and unresponsive, making it increasingly difficult to perform even basic medical procedures. The cold was setting in despite the desert heat, a clear sign that shock was advancing. Through sheer force of will, Maria managed to stabilize Johnson's condition enough to buy him additional time. She couldn't stop the internal bleeding or repair the serious damage to his leg, but she could slow the blood loss and maintain his airway. Every action required enormous effort, and she had to rest for several minutes between each medical intervention. The sound of helicopters in the distance brought a momentary surge of hope, but the aircraft passed overhead without stopping. Either they couldn't land safely in the active firefight, or they were heading to another emergency elsewhere in the city. The radio chatter suggested that multiple American units were under attack throughout Fallujah, stretching rescue resources beyond their limits. Williams began showing signs of increased consciousness, his eyelids fluttering and his breathing pattern changing. Head injuries were notoriously unpredictable, and any change in his condition could indicate either improvement or catastrophic deterioration. Maria forced herself to crawl closer to check his pupils and assess his neurological status, each movement requiring more effort than the last. The afternoon sun was beginning to beat down mercilessly on their exposed position. Dehydration and heat exhaustion would soon become additional threats to their survival. Maria's own thirst was becoming overwhelming, but the soldiers she was treating needed whatever water remained more than she did. She used precious drops from her damaged canteen to moisten their lips and keep their airways clear. Rodriguez and his remaining soldiers were still pinned down, unable to reach the wounded men or provide effective covering fire. The insurgents had positioned themselves perfectly to maintain their advantage, and any attempt to cross the open ground would likely result in additional casualties. The Americans were trapped in a tactical nightmare with no good options for escape or rescue. As her strength continued to fade, Maria began to accept the reality of her situation. She was dying, slowly but inevitably, in a dusty street thousands of miles from home. But she had kept her oath as a medic, fighting to preserve life even as her own life ebbed away. Johnson and Williams were still breathing, still alive, still fighting because of her actions. The insurgent gunfire seemed to be slackening slightly, either because the fighters were conserving ammunition or because they were repositioning for a final assault. Maria used this brief respite to make final adjustments to the wounded soldiers' positions, ensuring their airways remained clear and their wounds were as stable as possible. She had done everything humanly possible with the resources available. Her vision was fading more frequently now, and each return to consciousness was weaker than the last. Maria knew she was approaching the point of no return, but she also knew that rescue forces were en route. The question was whether help would arrive in time to save the soldiers she had fought so desperately to keep alive. Night fell over Fallujah like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a temporary decrease in the intensity of the insurgent attack. Maria Santos had been lying in her own blood for over 6 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, while continuing to monitor the 2 wounded soldiers beside her. The darkness provided some concealment from enemy snipers, but it also made it nearly impossible to assess the condition of Johnson and Williams properly. The temperature drop that came with nightfall created new challenges for their survival. In the desert, night temperatures could plummet 40 degrees or more, and hypothermia became a real threat for wounded soldiers already weakened by blood loss and shock. Maria used her own body heat to warm Johnson, who was showing signs of dangerous temperature fluctuation. Despite the earlier heat of the day, Rodriguez and his team had managed to establish radio contact with multiple rescue units throughout the evening, but each potential rescue operation had been called off due to intense enemy fire. The insurgents seemed determined to prevent any American reinforcements from reaching the trapped soldiers. Rocket-propelled grenades had been fired at 2 different helicopter attempts, forcing the aircraft to abort their landing approaches. The sounds of urban warfare echoed throughout the city, as multiple American units engaged insurgent fighters in running battles through the narrow streets. Explosions and gunfire provided a constant backdrop to their desperate situation, making it clear that the ambush on their convoy was part of a larger coordinated attack across Fallujah. Every available rescue resource was being stretched to its absolute limit. Maria's consciousness came and went like ocean waves, each period of awareness bringing fresh assessment of her deteriorating condition. The pain had evolved beyond simple agony into something almost otherworldly, a complete sensory experience that threatened to overwhelm her remaining rational thought. Yet somehow, through pure determination, she maintained her focus on the medical needs of her fellow soldiers. During one period of clarity, she noticed that Williams was showing signs of improved neurological function. His responses to stimuli were becoming more appropriate, and his breathing pattern had stabilized into something closer to normal sleep, rather than unconsciousness. Head injuries remained unpredictable, but these changes suggested that his brain was beginning to recover from the initial trauma. Johnson's condition remained more precarious. The multiple wounds to his leg had resulted in significant blood loss, and despite Maria's best efforts to control the bleeding, his pulse remained weak and thready. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that she recognized as a sign of advancing shock. Without surgical intervention and blood transfusion, his chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour. The insurgent fighters had settled into defensive positions around the area, apparently content to wait for daylight before launching any final assault. Their tactical patience suggested military training, rather than the impulsive actions of untrained militants. These were professional soldiers or former soldiers who understood the value of controlling the battlefield and waiting for optimal conditions before striking. Around midnight, Maria heard the distant sound of armored vehicles moving through the city. The distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles suggested that heavy American forces were finally responding to the multiple ambushes throughout Fallujah. Hope flickered briefly in her chest, but she had learned not to count on rescue until it actually materialized. Too many potential relief efforts had been turned back by enemy fire. Her own physical condition continued its relentless decline. The 11 bullet wounds had created a complex pattern of internal and external bleeding that no field medicine could adequately address. She estimated that she had lost at least half of her total blood volume, a level of trauma that should have killed her hours ago. Only her exceptional physical conditioning and sheer determination were keeping her alive. The radio traffic had become increasingly urgent as American commanders realized the full scope of the coordinated insurgent attack. Multiple convoys were trapped or missing, and several forward operating bases were under sustained assault. The enemy had clearly planned this operation for weeks or months, timing it to coincide with reduced American patrols during the evening hours. Williams began to stir more frequently, occasionally mumbling incoherent words that suggested his consciousness was slowly returning. Maria tried to reassure him whenever he showed signs of awareness, using her weakening voice to let him know that help was coming, and that he needed to keep fighting. Her words were as much for her own benefit as his, a way of maintaining hope in an increasingly hopeless situation. The second day began with a renewed burst of insurgent activity as enemy fighters attempted to overrun the remaining American positions before reinforcements could arrive. The sound of automatic weapons fire intensified dramatically, punctuated by the distinctive explosions of rocket-propelled grenades and improvised explosive devices. The battle for Fallujah was reaching a critical phase. Maria used the early morning light to conduct a more thorough assessment of both wounded soldiers. Johnson's pulse was barely detectable and his breathing had become irregular and labored. She realized that he was approaching the final stages of shock and would probably not survive another hour without immediate medical intervention. Williams was more stable but still required urgent evacuation to a proper medical facility. The sound of approaching helicopters created another surge of hope, but the aircraft were forced to retreat when insurgent fighters launched a coordinated anti-aircraft attack. Rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire filled the sky, making any helicopter landing attempt suicidal. The enemy had clearly prepared for American rescue operations and positioned weapons specifically to counter aerial evacuation. efforts, Rodriguez is increasingly desperate. Radio calls painted a clear picture of their tactical situation. The remaining members of the convoy were running critically low on ammunition and water. They had been pinned down for over 18 hours with no resupply, and their ability to defend their position was rapidly diminishing. Without immediate relief, the entire unit would be overrun within hours. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Maria felt her own life force ebbing away like water flowing from a broken vessel. Her vision was becoming increasingly blurred, and periods of unconsciousness were lasting longer than moments of awareness. She had given everything she had to give, pushing her broken body far beyond its natural limits in service to her fellow soldiers. The second day stretched endlessly under the merciless Iraqi sun as Maria Santos fought a battle against death itself. Her body had been pushed far beyond human limits, yet her mind remained stubbornly focused on the two soldiers whose lives depended on her continued vigilance. Johnson's breathing had become so shallow that she had to place her ear against his chest to confirm he was still alive, while Williams drifted in and out of consciousness with increasing frequency. The insurgent fighters had maintained their positions throughout the night, creating an impenetrable ring around the trapped Americans. Any movement in the area drew immediate and accurate gunfire, effectively creating a death zone that prevented rescue operations. The enemy's tactical discipline suggested this was no amateur operation, but a carefully planned military engagement, designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. Radio communications revealed that the battle for Fallujah had expanded into a city-wide uprising involving hundreds of insurgent fighters. American forces were engaged in fierce combat throughout multiple districts, with several units reporting heavy casualties and urgent requests for reinforcement. The coordinated nature of the attack suggested months of planning and preparation by experienced military commanders. Maria's periods of consciousness were becoming brief flashes of awareness, separated by longer intervals of darkness. During these moments of clarity, she forced herself to check on Johnson and Williams, adjusting their positions to maintain clear airways and monitoring their vital signs with increasingly unsteady hands. Her own pulse had become irregular and weak, a clear indication that her cardiovascular system was beginning to fail. The heat of the second day created additional challenges for all three wounded soldiers. Dehydration was becoming a critical factor in their survival, and Maria's damaged canteen had long since been emptied. She tried to shade Johnson and Williams with pieces of equipment and clothing, but the relentless sun turned their position into a furnace that sapped what little strength remained in their bodies. Captain Rodriguez and his surviving team members were facing their own desperate situation. They had been without food or water for over 24 hours, and their ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. The insurgent fighters seemed content to wait them out, knowing that time was on their side. Every hour that passed without rescue increased the likelihood that the entire American unit would be wiped out. Around midday, the sound of heavy aircraft engines brought renewed hope to the trapped soldiers. A massive C-130 gunship began circling the area, its sensors scanning for targets while its crew coordinated with ground forces to identify insurgent positions. The aircraft's presence immediately changed the tactical balance, forcing enemy fighters to seek better cover and reducing the intensity of their fire. The gunship's arrival marked the beginning of a sustained air campaign against insurgent positions throughout the neighborhood. Precision strikes targeted buildings that had been identified as enemy strongholds, while the aircraft's sensors tracked fighter movements through the urban terrain. For the first time in over 30 hours, the Americans had gained some tactical advantage in the engagement. Maria felt a surge of hope as the sounds of battle shifted in favor of the rescue forces. The constant crack of insurgent rifles was being replaced by the deeper rumble of American heavy weapons and the whistle of incoming artillery rounds. Air power was finally being brought to bear on the enemy positions that had kept them trapped for so long. Williams showed dramatic improvement as the day progressed, with periods of consciousness becoming longer and more coherent. He was able to communicate briefly with Maria, confirming that he understood their situation and expressing gratitude for her medical care. His neurological responses suggested that the head injury, while serious, had not caused permanent brain damage. Johnson's condition remained critical despite the improving tactical situation. The multiple trauma to his leg combined with massive Blood loss had pushed his body to the absolute edge of survival. Maria knew that even if rescue arrived within the next few hours, Johnson would require immediate surgical intervention and blood transfusion to have any chance of living through his injuries. The airstrikes continued throughout the afternoon, systematically destroying insurgent positions and clearing corridors for potential rescue operations. American ground forces were finally able to advance through several sectors of the city, pushing the enemy fighters back from their carefully prepared positions. The tide of battle was turning, but the question remained whether it was turning quickly enough. As evening approached, Maria's consciousness began fading more frequently and for longer periods. Her body temperature was dropping despite the heat, and her pulse was becoming increasingly difficult to detect. She had survived far longer than anyone could have expected with 11 bullet wounds, but her remarkable endurance was finally reaching its natural limits. The insurgent fire had decreased significantly due to the ongoing airstrikes, but enemy fighters still controlled key positions around the trapped Americans. Any rescue attempt would require ground forces to fight their way through multiple defensive positions while extracting wounded soldiers under fire. The tactical challenges remained enormous despite the improved air support. Rodriguez received word over the radio that a special operations rescue team was being assembled to attempt an extraction after nightfall. The elite soldiers would use darkness and suppressive fire to reach the trapped convoy and evacuate the wounded. It would be a dangerous operation with no guarantee of success, but it represented their best hope for survival. Maria used her remaining strength to prepare Johnson and Williams for potential evacuation. She organized what medical supplies remained within reach and positioned the soldiers to facilitate rapid extraction by rescue forces. Every movement was agony, but she knew that proper preparation could mean the difference between successful rescue and additional casualties. The sun began to set over Fallujah for the second time since the ambush began, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Maria watched the sunset through failing eyes, wondering if she would live to see another dawn. She had done everything humanly possible to keep her fellow soldiers alive, pushing her broken body far beyond its limits in service to her oath as a combat medic. As darkness fell, the sounds of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance. Heavy engines and the distinctive rattle of tracked vehicles suggested that significant American forces were finally moving to rescue the trapped soldiers. After more than 36 hours of hell, help was finally on the way. The roar of approaching helicopters cut through the night air like thunder. But these weren't the same aircraft that had been turned away by insurgent fire. The distinctive sound signature identified them as Navy SEAL insertion helicopters, specially modified for combat operations in hostile territory. Maria Santos, barely conscious after 2 days of hell, recognized the difference in the engine notes and knew that elite rescue forces were finally arriving. The SEAL team hit the ground with military precision that had been honed through years of combat operations. 12 operators moved through the darkness like ghosts, their night vision equipment allowing them to navigate the urban terrain while remaining invisible to enemy fighters. They had been briefed on the location of the trapped Americans and the estimated positions of insurgent forces throughout the area. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison led the rescue team with calm efficiency that came from leading similar operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. His team had been monitoring radio communications from the trapped convoy for hours, planning their approach and coordinating with air support to maximize their chances of success. They knew that wounded Americans were depending on them, and failure was not an option. The SEALs encountered their first resistance while still 3 blocks away from the convoy position. Insurgent fighters had established defensive positions along likely approach routes, but they hadn't prepared for the night vision capabilities and superior training of special operations forces. The enemy positions were eliminated quickly and quietly, allowing the rescue team to continue their advance. Maria heard the distinctive pop of suppressed gunfire getting closer to their position and realized that the rescue attempt was actually happening. She tried to prepare Johnson and Williams for extraction, but her own strength was almost completely gone. The 11 bullet wounds had finally taken their toll, and she could barely maintain consciousness long enough to assess the condition of the soldiers she had kept alive. Williams was now fully conscious and alert enough to understand that rescue was imminent. Despite his head injury, He was able to communicate effectively with Maria and help her monitor Johnson's deteriorating condition. Johnson remained unconscious and in critical condition, but his pulse was still detectable and his breathing continued despite massive blood loss. The SEAL team's point man reached the overturned vehicle just after midnight, exactly 48 hours after the original ambush. Through his night vision scope, he could see 3 figures lying behind the wreckage, with one person clearly attempting to provide medical care to the others. The scene confirmed intelligence reports about a medic who had continued treating wounded soldiers despite being severely injured herself. Morrison quickly assessed the tactical situation and established a defensive perimeter around the wounded Americans. His team's medical specialist immediately took over treatment of the injured soldiers, while other operators prepared them for emergency evacuation. The condition of all 3 patients was far worse than anyone had expected, particularly the female medic who had multiple gunshot wounds. The SEAL medic was amazed to find that Maria was still alive after sustaining 11 separate bullet wounds over a 48-hour period. Her continued survival defied medical logic and demonstrated a level of physical and mental toughness that impressed even the elite operators. She had somehow maintained enough functionality to provide life-saving medical care to her fellow soldiers while dying from her own injuries. Johnson was immediately identified as the most critical patient, requiring immediate surgical intervention that could only be provided at a major medical facility. The SEAL medic stabilized his condition enough for transport, while coordinating with helicopter crews about landing zone preparation. Every second counted in getting him to definitive medical care. Williams was stable enough to assist with his own evacuation, and his head injury appeared to be healing without major complications. His recovery was largely due to the medical care he had received from Maria during the critical first hours after the ambush. Without her intervention, his condition would likely have deteriorated into a fatal brain injury. The evacuation helicopter arrived, under heavy covering fire from Apache gunships that had been suppressing insurgent positions throughout the neighborhood. The landing zone was established in a nearby courtyard that provided enough space for the aircraft while maintaining protection from enemy fire. The precision timing required split-second coordination between multiple aircraft and ground forces. Maria was loaded onto the helicopter first due to the severity of her injuries, followed by Johnson and Williams. The SEAL team remained on the ground to secure the area and extract the remaining members of Rodriguez's convoy. The entire rescue operation had taken less than 30 minutes from initial contact to helicopter departure. During the flight to the military hospital, Maria drifted in and out of consciousness while military medics worked frantically to stabilize her condition. She had lost an enormous amount of blood and suffered massive internal injuries, but her vital signs remained stable enough to suggest that she might survive if she received immediate surgical intervention. The helicopter touched down at the military hospital's trauma center, where surgical teams had been standing by for hours. Maria was rushed directly into emergency surgery while Johnson and Williams were taken to separate operating rooms. The next few hours would determine whether the heroic rescue operation had arrived in time to save all 3 soldiers. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead trauma surgeon, had never seen a patient survive 11 gunshot wounds over a 48-hour period without any advanced medical support. Maria's case would become legendary in military medical circles as an example of human endurance and the power of determination to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Surgery lasted 18 hours and required the skills of multiple specialists working in coordination. Maria's injuries were so extensive that the surgical team had to prioritize which damage to repair first while maintaining her vital functions. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations. Though Maria would face months of rehabilitation and recovery, Johnson survived his emergency surgery and eventually made a full recovery, returning to active duty after extensive rehabilitation. Williams recovered completely from his head injury with no lasting neurological effects. Both men credited Maria Santos with saving their lives through her extraordinary dedication and medical expertise under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Maria Santos was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, becoming one of the most decorated female combat medics in military history. Her actions in Fallujah demonstrated that heroism knows no gender, and that the human spirit can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges when fighting to save the lives of others. She had taken 11 rounds and survived, but more importantly, she had ensured that her fellow soldiers survived as well.